I wanted to know what it's really like inside women's prisons in general, and specifically what it may be like for Lori Daybell if she is found guilty of the murders of her two children. So, who better to ask than a former women's prison inmate? After over a decade in prison, Marci Marie Simmons has shared her story and her experiences to build a following across several platforms of about 300,000 people. So I hope you enjoy this video as we talk women's prisons in general, women inmates, and after that, Lori Daybell. Okay, so first of all, thank you for doing this. Thank you for joining. I told some of my subscribers earlier that I was going to be doing this interview, and they're really glad to hear that because they've been wanting to hear from a woman who's done some time, and just get a bunch of questions answered from her. So just first, can you tell us a little bit about your background, where you served time, how long, what for, maybe?
Sure. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. And so I had a 20-year sentence for a white collar crime. The charge was theft over $200,000. I'm guilty. I did it. I got sentenced. And I spent a little over 10 years in prison in a Texas prison. I didn't go to the feds.
Hmm.
So.
Wow. Yeah, I also got a 10-year sentence, but I did like 9. So did almost that much time, but okay. Well, I guess first, a lot of people want to know, is there any kind of mental health counseling offered there? And I mean, if there is, I know sometimes there's programs offered in there and they're presented to be, I mean, is there anything like that there? And is it effective if so?
So I think kind of what you were talking about, a lot's on paper and not so much is actually in movement and actuality. It's not tangible. So I was on a unit with about 1,300 women. And I think we had 2 healthcare providers or mental health care providers on that unit, which honestly, anybody that goes to prison, anybody and everybody that goes to prison needs some kind of mental health care.
Yeah.
So with them concentrating on the severe cases, everything else that just wasn't somebody in direct threat to hurt themselves or others didn't get any kind of mental health care treatment.
Right. And it seems like, just to build on that, I mean, this just in my experience, it seems like they're really there more to, besides counsel you through these problems, maybe just see if you need medication or not, mainly. So it's kind of scary
That's
to
for
even go
sure.
to them.
Yeah, that's for sure. You could get medicated. You
Yeah.
could get medicated in there for your mental health because it was a drop one form and they want everybody medicated and mellowed out. And it was easy to get on psych drugs and lots of people were on them.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. Well, they also want to know how, are there the women's, more feminine health care needs met in there, the hygiene products, I believe prenatal specifically someone wanted to know about. And also just, a side note, they're also curious about makeup. Is there any type of makeup offered, or I know we can get creative, so maybe they come up with their own. How does all that work?
So I'll start with makeup and then we'll get into the
Okay.
deeper stuff, right? Makeup in county jail, we didn't have any makeup. And the videos that you see with women using fireballs for lipstick, I did a video showing how I used to make mascara with toothpaste and ink from a pen. I'd apply it with a toothbrush.
Wow.
So that definitely happened in county jail. Once I got to prison, Texas prisons, women's unit sell makeup. So I got to buy mascara, different eyeshadows, foundations that may or may not. And then we use some home remedies also, like eyebrow pencils. We had to make that on our own because they didn't have that.
Yeah.
So we had some other little tricks that we used, but yes, they sold makeup.
Okay.
Um, Prenatal care. So Texas houses a lot of inmates. And so they have several women's units.
Mhm.
And there is a unit that's specific for pregnant women, and it's near the hospital. And so they do get prenatal care to an extent. They get their vitamins. They do get to go to medical and get checked. I don't think it's probably the quality you would get in the free world, but it's
Right.
decent. They're making sure the baby's okay. Um, the problem with the care there is really after the baby's born. So generally out here in the free world, doctors tell you take several weeks, let your body heal. It's a major deal to have a baby. And in Texas prisons, those ladies are going back to work just weeks after. Sometimes they're still bleeding from the birth of their child and out there working in the fields. In Texas, we have Ho Squad, Field Squad, much like plantation work. And I've seen ladies crying and suffering through that shortly after delivery, because as soon as they have their baby, they're shipped back to a real unit.
Yeah.
So,
Wow. Um, so number three, why do you think they shave male inmates' heads, and not, of course, I mean, they don't shave women's heads, but I mean, do they cut their hair at all? Because they tell us, we have to get our head shaves when we go there, and they tell us the reason is because of lice, reduce the risk of that. But if that was true, why can't our hair, it's if how does that work? I mean, do they cut your hair? Is there a requirement at all for that?
I'll tell you what, it's not about lice. It's about making you feel less of a human. It's just one more thing that they do to you. Because what they do for us, no, they don't cut our hair. Now, I do have a friend that did time in Virginia, and their hair had to be shoulder length. I don't know if that's still the rule today, but in Texas prisons, no, they don't cut your hair. But you go through a process where an officer literally throws delousing powder on you in the shower. And you're made to rub that in your hair and on your body.
Wow. I didn't know that.
So it's humiliating also, right? But yeah.
I think they do see it in South Carolina. They do the shoulder length thing too for the women inmates. But yeah, that's interesting. Now male prisons, they're known to have a pretty heavy gang presence and just a lot of violence overall. Is that the same in women's prisons, or no, or how does that work there?
So in Texas women's prisons, for sure, there's not. You will come across some women that maybe their husbands or boyfriends or dads or uncles are affiliated in some way. That means nothing in there.
Oh,
Yeah, I've so much so that I will see women coming out of maybe white affiliated gangs, AB, AC, that kind of thing, and get into physical relationships, romantic relationships with women of other races. And that, so it's nothing. There is no gang, and there's no segregation. We don't segregate ourselves. I mean, we're just all, there's a kind of a clique, like a high school cliquish kind of thing. So you kind of click up with your group, but it's not by race at all.
Oh, well, what about the violence? Is there a lot of that? Just, even without the gang presence, I mean, is there still a lot of fights, or not often? What?
So most of the violence in women's prisons is domestic violence. It has to do with relationships or hurt feelings, even close friends that maybe they're not intimate, but most of the violence is around that. It's very rarely, I mean, I haven't seen anything like really drastic violence that wasn't domestic violence. Now they get ugly, cut each other, and all of the RAPE, all of that is ugly, but all that's domestic. The other kind of violence is maybe somebody maybe has a short temper over a sports game or over a seat in a day room. And every now and then you see those kind of fights, but the majority, it's pretty easy not to get in a fight if you don't get in other people's relationships, or you don't get in a bad one yourself, right?
Right. Well, that's interesting. I didn't know that. And it's it compared to my experience, just I didn't see, there wasn't a lot of relationship type of thing going on, and if there was, it was extremely rare and kept extremely down low. It sounds like, I mean, that's a very common thing. It must be much more common in women's prisons, do you think?
It's absolutely much more common, I think, in women's prisons and completely socially acceptable in
Yeah.
that environment. So there's no, I mean, it's nothing for that to happen, whether the women are gay for the stay, where they're just coming to find that companionship to help them with their time, emotionally and maybe physically, or if it's women in lesbian
Yeah.
relationships. Yeah, that's very common.
Okay. Wow. So, as far as like contraband, in my prisons, there's cell phones, tobacco, drugs, everything you can think of all over the place. Hardly ever a shortage of it. What is it like in women's prisons?
So I was there, I was on a maximum security unit, by the way, because Texas kind of throws you all in there together.
Right.
So I was with people, with big crimes, with big
Mhm.
long sentences. And I never once saw a cell phone. I never heard of anyone having a cell phone. We had typewriters that they sold on commissary, and we had a new officer come by one time and heard the typewriter and made a call, and we were locked down for 3 days because that officer thought that maybe it was a cell phone, but it was my bunkie two cubicles over, and it was a typewriter. So
Wow.
no, it was not. Now drugs, I think maybe I saw marijuana like twice. Every now and then people would get pills in. That was also a common, if somebody had a relationship with an officer, that was a common thing that they would request because you want to sleep, right?
Yeah.
And so it was that kind, but I never saw anything or heard of anything. And I was in all custody levels. I moved around. I didn't do my time the easy way. I look like this, but in the middle of my sentence, I kind of lost my shit. And
Yeah.
I went all the way down. So I feel like I have a pretty good grasp, and
Right.
no, that wasn't happening in there. And no
Wow.
tobacco. Mm-mm.
Man. Well, let me ask you this, then we'll probably move on to a few about Lori Daybell. Um, what's the worst thing you saw in prison? Everyone always wants to know that when they're talking to someone who served time.
Yeah. So I have, and I want to go back to feminine hygiene too
Okay.
when we
Okay.
finish this, but um, so there's probably two things that pop in my mind when you say that, and one would be just involving inmates, and one would be involving officers. And so I saw a woman that was very mentally ill. We were in the day room. So I lived in a cell block housing at this time. So it's 2 stores of cell block housing surrounding a day room. We're in the day room, and she goes upstairs to her cell and leaves the cell door open. And she just wasn't okay. And she just took a razor blade. So we get razors, and
Yeah.
she broke down the razor and pulled the blade out, and just cut herself everywhere you could think of,
Mm.
inside of her even. It looked like a horror movie. It was
Wow.
it was pretty, yeah. And that was self-inflicted, but
Yeah.
uh, yeah. So and then another time we had I was in cell block housing
Mhm.
again. And so it's 3 dorms or 3 pods around the picket, and it's all windows so the guards can see everything. And my pod is in the day room waiting to go to pill line. And we're sitting on the benches. There's about 20 of us out there. And the next pod is coming in from pill line. And we're not supposed to communicate through the glass. So we're not
Yeah.
supposed to wave if you see your friend, but we do because we know each other. We've been doing time with each other, and we're human. So,
Mm.
and so the girl comes in from pill line and she waves at us, and we wave back. And the officer just completely overreacted. The girl was young. And so the officers talking really crappy to her, calling her derogatory names, and the girl's getting back with the officer. And before we know it, the girl's kind of in the officer's face. And of course, that officer just picks up the radio and she calls for backup. And all of a sudden, here they are. And cell block officers have vests on, like it's body armor, right?
Right.
So they're kind of suited up, and it's men and women, and they're out of view of the camera, and they just stomp this little girl. And
Hmm.
she's handcuffed on the ground, and she's talking shit, but she's completely subdued and overpowered. And we are watching them kick her and hit her. And I mean, grown men. It was horrifying. What was more horrifying is that we all wrote about it. We all wrote it in and went through the grievance process. And
Yeah.
as far as we knew, nothing happened. The girl got
Right.
a UT, sent her off the unit. All those officers were still working. So
Yeah. That's about how effective grievances are. You know, they don't. It seems like they never make it to where they're supposed to make it. That's
for sure,
awful. That's awful.
for sure.
Well, let me ask you this. Of course, you know, if you're familiar with Lori Daybell, she is charged with the murders of her two children. Um, is murdering your child like a specific crime that's maybe looked at more harshly, you know, in a women's prison? I mean, are they going to treat her different for that? Is that like maybe one of the ultimate sins in there, or is it just kind of just it's another crime?
Do you guys, y'all don't have the death penalty? I meant to look before we got on here,
Um,
because in Texas, she
we
would
do.
probably,
We do
so
have death row.
yeah, that's definitely a possibility for her. Um, in Texas, that would be for sure a possibility for her. Now, yes, I was incarcerated with lots of people, lots of mothers that killed their babies,
Mm,
whether it was postpartum depression or postpartum psychosis, or whether it was whatever the hell was wrong with them,
right.
you know. Um, it's not like you might think. I think that you could speak on in a men's prison, like if it's a child crime, they're going to get a lot more aggression towards them, and they're going to get stolen from. And it's just not like that. It's like I said, women are cliquish, so they're going to be left out of things. They're not going to be they're not physically in danger, and
Yeah.
no, they would not be in protective custody. They would be in general custody. I was with a woman that starved her child. He was for years, and she was right there working with us,
Yeah.
sleeping with us, showering with us. And hers was probably the most heinous child crime. The worst that people would get is if they got in an argument, they would throw it up in her face.
Yeah.
She didn't, I don't think, to my knowledge, experience any physical harm from that.
Yeah. Wow. Well, and you know that was my one of my other questions too, as far as if she'll be separated in any way or if she will be in general population. But it sounds like unless, you know, and I think they're talking about. I would have to double check, but I think they're saying they're not going to, you know, they're taking the death penalty off the table for her. Um, but yeah, unless she received that, it sounds like she'd probably just be in general population, right?
Yeah, I believe so. If you guys are anything like Texas prisons, for sure she would be.
Yeah.
Yeah, sometimes you would not want to, you know, moving money around and that kind of thing. You get people's real name, and you get people's ID number, and then your family looks them up. And that was always kind of horrifying when details would come back in of what
Yeah.
some of these ladies had done. And um, you know, some of it is reaction, but when it's just constant torture on a child, it's pretty disheartening, especially
Yeah.
when you're sleeping next to her.
Yeah. Yeah. I imagine. Well, I got one last question for you. What is one thing that you would like everyone to know about either women's prisons in general or just, you know, women who have to serve time or who have served time in prison?
So that's a great question. Thank you for that.
Mhm.
So I was on a maximum security unit. I was with lots of women that had been convicted of very heinous crimes. Um, and I never came across one woman in there that said, I'm so glad I did that. And I can't wait to get out there and do that again. What I did come across was women that had been broken long before they entered the system, and that there was this whole pile of circumstances around their charge. And so I just encourage people to look at the whole picture. because it's easy to look at a piece of paper or a computer screen and see some kind of murder charge or kidnapping charge. But when you don't know the whole story, I just think that's really important.
Yeah, it is. And I agree. And that's a great answer. Well, again, thank you for doing this. It was great to have you, and you can come back anytime if you want. And to everyone watching, if there's any questions that you would like to ask her that you didn't see asked today, I encourage you to go follow her on her social medias and ask her herself. I'm sure she'll get back to you.
I will. Thanks so much for having me. Sure appreciate you.
You're welcome. So, it sounds like Lori Daybell's experience may not be what most of us were thinking or expecting it would be. Also, what I gather from this interview, maybe if the men in prisons could take a note and take a lesson from the women and the lack of violence that they have towards each other, try to take care of one another rather than harm each other and tear each other apart, maybe prison would be an overall safer place and less dangerous for everybody. Thank you again to Marci Marie for joining me on this interview. Hope you all enjoyed it, and make sure you subscribe because I will be back soon with another video.